Hello, ladies and gents, very good morning and welcome all thanks for joining us this morning. First of all, a big thank you to all of you guys for coming out and your continued support, clients, friends, over the last 10 years. This is Aucor Property's 10th year. We're in for a very interesting year ahead, coming out of effectively 2 years of COVID, and very interesting times in the economy. Today we're honored to have two very special guests speaking to us. Both of them don't need much introduction. Mandy Wiener, who we all know from our midday report in 702, and as well as being a very accomplished author. And then probably one of the country's most respected economists, Dawie Roodt, especially in the monetary policy sector. I'd like to now hand over to Mandy, who'll give us a brief intro.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to the Aucor Property Breakfast. So thank you all of you for dressing up for the occasion. I think I've counted a tie in the audience today, but I was warned about the crowd, and I think that apparently all you need to know about the budget yesterday is that you're going to be paying R4.83 more for a bottle of spirits. So that's about the summary, hey Dawie? That's all people really need to know. Oh, and R6.77 for a cigar is what you're going to be paying more. So that's your business breakfast budget in a nutshell. That's all you need to know. So Dawie's going to be speaking about the budget. How many of you actually watched the budget yesterday? Wow, guys. That's why you're here, right? So I was going to ask you, how are you feeling about the budget? Was there anything that resonated with you? Anything that you worried about? Anything that encouraged you? No? Okay, so how are we all feeling about the country at the moment and the world, considering Ukraine has just been invaded this morning? The invasion has begun, and we may be on the brink of something enormous. And the news cycle can be pretty overwhelming. There's a lot going on. If you look at South Africa, what's been happening with the July unrest last year, the National Assembly going up in flames. I mean, we have 10 missing babies that nobody knows where they are. Apparently, they were sold off for human trafficking, these 10 babies from Tembisa. So how do you feel about the news cycle in South Africa? And generally, what is your sentiments about the country? Anyone? Give me a shout. No? Cautious. How about cautiously optimistic? Is that pushing it? Huh? So I think everyone's feeling a bit cautious, a bit trepidatious. I'm sure Dawie's going to cover most of that. I'm going to, I suppose, just give you a sense politically of where we are in the country at the moment before we get into the budget. And Dawie and I were talking about this. I think he's more concerned about his April holiday in Russia, which is clearly not going to happen anymore, unless you want to have a front row seat to the Third World War. But I think that in the country it's very, very easy for us to fall into this default setting of being very negative about what is happening. And you hear these kind of conversations all the time at breakfast tables and at water coolers and at braais or wherever you might be, where people generally have quite a negative sentiment about the country. And that's the default narrative, is that people think that nothing is getting done and the turnaround is happening too slow and that growth is a huge problem. Our unemployment figures are just astronomical. I'm sure Dawie will cover some of this as well. Youth unemployment, the figure sitting there at the highest it's ever been. And I think that what happened after the July unrest definitely fed into that sentiment. But I always say that as a journalist, and I'm on radio every day, and I write columns about this every week, I see the very worst of the country. My job is literally to speak about the failings of government on a daily basis and to highlight this. And yet I am cautiously optimistic about the country, because I do think that there is more than one narrative that we can tell. And it's very easy to focus on the negative sentiments where there are positive stories that are happening. And I'm not being naive about this. I'm not being, only glossing over the bad stuff. Of course, the negative stuff is there if you want to see it. The crime statistics, the unemployment rate, the growth rate, there are serious problems that we need to address. And I completely appreciate the sentiment around the president. I like to call him Captain Passive because he just takes so long to get anything done because of his consultative nature. But I think we also have to fully appreciate what we went through as this country over the past 10 years through the state capture era. And the state capture era was a deliberate, intentional campaign to eviscerate state-owned entities and law enforcement agencies. And it's only through the Zondo Commission that we are now finally seeing the full extent of that. I always say sunlight is the best disinfectant. And we've really seen the extent of the capture and what went wrong. And that restoration process, that rebuilding process that we are seeing now at various entities is long and slow and gradual and difficult. And we are all running out of patience. So look at the NPA as an example. Everybody wants to see prosecutions and convictions. And Shamila Batoy, when she came in as NDPP, spoke about how this was like a house on fire. It's like fixing an airplane while in flight. And I can tell you now that we have come a long way from where we were at the NPA. It's not happening fast enough. But that process of recapacitating is enormous. They lost so much capacity to the private sector. They are reliant on the hawks, who at one stage did not even have a forensic accountant within their ranks. So to try and unravel a spaghetti like Steinhoff, or any of the captures of Prasa or Transnet or Denel is so difficult. So that process is slowly happening. I expect to see lots more prosecutions after Part 3 of the Zondo Commission is out. And then at all of the different entities at Eskom, I'm sure you'll touch on this as well, Dawie, is that this process of turning around these SOEs is mammoth. You know, there was a time when Eskom was paying 29 Rand for a roll of toilet paper. So, you know, if you think about that and what we heard yesterday from Enoch Godongwana about Eskom, of course, you know, there's still massive debt, but that process is slowly happening. So I do always say, and I think that maybe we disagree on this. We were talking earlier about how optimistic we are about the country and whether we're just realists or not. I think we'll have a debate about this afterwards. But I do lean towards being more positive. But also keep in mind that this is an ANC election year. So everything has to be viewed through that lens. The fact that every single decision that the president makes is in the context of an ANC leadership battle. And that is a huge concern because we know that he is a president that prioritizes party over country. And, you know, if you look at the fact that we had this expert report coming out on the July unrest, which pointed to just the culpability of the executive, of the incompetence of the police leadership and the police minister, he has to act against one of them or both of them. It's an untenable situation. And yet politically it's a very difficult decision for him to make because of the context of the ANC leadership. So everything that happens this year has to be viewed in that context. And I am a believer that in the second term of Ramaphosa's ANC presidency, because I do not believe that there is a real contestation from Lindiwe Sisulu, who's on her own crazy mission at the moment, with her attacks on the judiciary, I do think that Ramaphosa will have a second term, and then much of the groundwork that he's been laying in the first term will hopefully come to fruition. But I'm sure Dawie will speak more about this as well, and there will be a Q&A session at the end, which we'll facilitate. So if you have questions, we'll be asking them at the end, and I'll have some questions for Dawie as well. But I think just looking at the budget yesterday, a lot of people were saying it's a good news budget, that Enoch Godongwana has put money back in our pockets. And he admitted at the start of his budget, for those of all of you who did not watch it, clearly, that he was a bit scared when he took over the position, because you always want to hear your finance minister tell you that he was a bit scared when he took over in August last year. But he says that he feels more relaxed now, and the fiscus is starting to turn the tide, so he's not as panicky as he was. So there are some real highlights in the budget. Many commentators saying that it is a light at the end of the tunnel, that we're starting to turn the corner. And I think that that's how I personally, I don't know about you, feel that we are starting to turn a corner. and that there are prospects, green shoots, if you'd like to call them, about what's going to be happening. But of course, we still have enormous issues around debt, around growth, around employment, and we have to be realistic about all of that. Of course, 46% of all South Africans are on social grants, which is also just an untenable situation. So I look forward to hearing more from Dawie on all of this, and he will take questions at the end. I'm also happy to take questions. But to introduce Dawie, and I have a very long CV, which I'm not going to go through all of it, because you all know Dawie, I'm sure, but he is the founder, the director, and chief economist of the Efficient Group. He serves on a variety of investment committees within the Efficient Group. He is also the chairman, and he is a nationally renowned economist with over 30 years of experience. He was telling me also that he's presented over 1,000 TV shows over the years. He has lots of degrees, and I will not go through all of them. But I found it really fascinating that he's an amateur ichthyologist. And Warren's going to give the first person who tells me what an ichthyologist is a bottle of whiskey, he told me. Does anybody know what an ichthyologist is? Fish! There we go. You have to give her a bottle of whiskey now. Sorry about that. Yeah, for the table, for breakfast. There we go, on your behalf. Sorry? Oh, in glasses, yeah. We can have 6 glasses, thank you. And he made a movie debut in Bubblus. I didn't know about that, Dawie. You can join the table for a bottle of whiskey. Lots of other interesting facts about him. But I'm going to hand over to you now, Dawie. I look forward to what you have to say.
Andy, and thank you very much for the invite. Actually, I'm the eternal optimist. I'm very, very optimistic about the future of the world, or I'm a little bit concerned about what's going on in Europe at the moment. Okay, let's get going. I've got a couple of slides, quite a number of slides, and I had a look at I completed this presentation yesterday afternoon, just after the speech of the Minister of Finance, standing in front of my fish tank, which is a 6,000-liter fish tank, full of Tanganyika chiclets and things I'm crazy about, especially lake fish. All right, let's get going on this presentation. I think what is important, first of all, to understand what is going on, where the world is, what is going on in the world, and it keeps on changing all the time. So just a few things on the global context that we need to understand. Globally, economies are opening up, and as economies are opening up, of course, there's an increase in demand globally. We all understand the supply chain disruptions that we've experienced. We have an increase in inflation internationally as well. There's a big debate amongst economists. Is this inflation that the world is currently experiencing, is it temporary or is it more permanent of nature? I think inflation, and the US inflation at the moment is 7.5%, the highest in 40 years. I think it's going to come down, but not to 2%, to roughly about 3-4%, I guess. So I think it's in between. So inflation is an issue. Part of another reason for the inflationary pressures internationally, this is important for South Africa because they're going to act. They're going to increase interest rates internationally, for example, which will affect us as well. But another important reason for inflationary pressures internationally has to do with this massive fiscal stimulation that we've seen, especially in the United States, where they're sending checks to Americans and they're spending this money, adding to the wave of demand, pushing up inflationary pressures internationally even more. This is all happening while interest rates are exceptionally low internationally. Very accommodative monetary policy stance internationally, low interest rates, and things called, like, for example, quantitative easing, where they print money out of nothing, create money out of nothing. And now we have Putin invading the Ukraine this morning. Now, maybe I can just give a bit of a context on that. I don't know if you can recall what happened in 1960 when the Russians placed a number of rockets in Cuba, and the world nearly went to war. Kennedy said, listen, you have to remove these rockets or I'm going to attack you, and it can lead to the Third World War. And eventually the Russians decided to remove that. In 1991, NATO declared that they will not expand their borders further to the east. They will not expand their membership further to the east. Since then, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and a number of other countries became members of NATO. And of course, even the Ukraine mentioned that they want to become members of NATO. If you put rockets in Kiev and you fire them to Moscow, they can reach Moscow within 5 minutes. So my question is, and I'm not taking any sides here, my question is really, what's the difference between that and what we saw in 1960? Pretty much the same kind of situation. If you look at the history of Russia, for example, they've been invaded by just about everybody. The Finns invaded them, the Poles invaded them, the French invaded them, the Russians invaded them, the Germans invaded, everybody invaded the Russians. They are paranoid because that's part of their history. So I'm not taking sides. I'm very concerned about what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment. I think it's probably going to be localized. I don't think the Americans or NATO is going to get involved. If they do get involved, and if there's a real war going up in Central Europe, then I think there's a very good possibility that Xi may see this as an opportunity to invade Taiwan. And then we are in for some serious stuff. So that's where we are at the moment. The oil price is close to about $100 already because of this. And the best that we can do in South Africa is just not to do anything. I think that's the best approach. A few other things, the commodity cycle, because of this huge increase in demand globally, commodity cycle is quite strong. And this is important for us because the commodity exporters are exporting like crazy, making a lot of money, paying a lot of taxes. I'll get to that a little bit later. If we do see interest rates going up internationally, which I expect to happen, remember, if interest rates go up in the US dollar goes up. If the dollar goes up, other things goes down. And that could lead to a bit of a slowdown in the commodity cycle, which we've already seen happening. And again, if the dollar goes up, the rand goes down. And what I'm concerned about, if that monetary policy is tightened internationally too much, too quickly, it can lead to a sudden depreciation of currencies, of emerging currencies. So to keep an eye on that. A bit of a riddle is that the employment participation rate in the United States and in Europe is quite low. Remember, unemployment doesn't mean the way that economists are looking at unemployment is people actually actively looking for jobs. And if you're not looking for a job, then you're not unemployed. So what we do find in the US is that employment levels are quite low, but unemployment levels are also quite low. So a lot of people are simply resigned and they do some other stuff, and we don't know what's going on. I have a suspicion that some of this has to do with work from home and the gig economy and stuff like that. And that's part of the reason why I'm very, very optimistic about the world's future. The markets are very volatile internationally, very uncertain. If interest rates go up, that's usually bad for equity markets and, of course, for the capital markets as well. The big question is, will earnings for the big companies internationally, will that last? We've seen some of the big companies doing just amazingly well the last 10 years and so on. And then the oil price. The Minister of Finance, he reckons that the oil price is going to slowly drift down to in the 70s over the next 2 or 3 years. Well, let's see. I don't know what's going to happen, but currently the oil price is at $100. Oil is South Africa's most important import product, by the way. Here are some of the reasons why I'm very, very optimistic about the future of the world economy, depending on politics, of course. Artificial intelligence, changes to retail. Retail is really going through dramatic changes. We're all experts on Takealot and Amazon and all that sort of stuff. It's much easier now to buy on the internet. Everything is changing to accommodate that. People are not going to normal shops anymore. You go to normal shops, to normal retail shops sometimes, just to have a look at a new TV or new computer, whatever, go back and order it and Takealot because it's cheaper. So there are some dramatic changes happening. The gig economy, there's a lot of economic activity that we're not even aware of. Let me give you just one example, and that is there's a study done in the US on the value of Googling. It's valuable to Google because you can just Google anything, but it's for free. If you have free internet, Wi-Fi, for example, you don't pay to Google. Yet the value of Googling, according to the study, is about $600 per individual annually. But it's not included in any economic data. So what I'm trying to say, this gig economy is actually adding a lot of economic activity that's not captured in normal economic data. And then some major other significant technological changes, financial technological changes that I'm very excited about. One is the introduction of central bank digital currencies. And it's a reality. Many of these central banks already introduced central bank digital currencies. That is going to lead to huge changes. That will lead to the complete overhaul of the banking system. And I am very sure that banking as we know it is going to disappear. see what's going to happen. But this is not what the talk is about. One day we'll come and talk about money. I love money. All right, the local context, couple of things happening locally. There's a lot of, as always, a lot of infighting within the ANC. There's disrespect for the Constitution. Now, this is important because the president in Sona did mention that it's the private sector that's supposed to create jobs, and he did mention he loves the Constitution and all that. But 2 weeks or so before that, one of his senior executives told everybody that she's not certainly in love with the Constitution. In fact, she called her boss, the president, a liar in public. Now, the president said he's going to remove red tape, he's going to make it easier for small businesses to do business in South Africa, but he simply cannot reprimand one of his senior executives and fire her and get rid of her, even though she calls him a liar in public. Now, that's why I don't think anything much is going to come from this. There's implementation of all sort of things to support the economy and small businesses, nothing or not much is going to come from that. And there's an excellent example of exactly that. We see continuous mismanagement of corruption and all incompetence and all that. And I want to make just a general comment here. And I think the ANC government has been or is the most destructive force the South African economy has ever seen. And I'm going to give you some of these numbers and so on. The new Minister of Finance, I think, is perhaps the best that the ANC has to offer. It doesn't mean he's good, but he's certainly the best that the ANC has to offer. There's a bit of a skeleton in the closet, a bit of an issue there. But I think he did a fairly good job yesterday. I think he's full of a lot of self-confidence, and I think he understands most of the numbers. Of course, we can disagree on the margin about some estimates on economic aggregates and so on, and I'm going to touch on some of those. But I think, broadly speaking, I'm more or less in line with the Minister's expectations on economic growth and stuff like that. Does this budgets and this in SONA, is it more or less in sync? And I would say yes. So what the President announced, and there are many things that the President announced, and it's pretty much in line with what the Minister of Finance said in the budget speech yesterday. All right, but in the meantime, let's understand a little bit more of the context in South Africa. And I've got some, just to show you where we are in South Africa. This is a comparison of a few things. Like, for example, a very important number that economists likely look at, and that is per capita income. Are we getting better off in South Africa? Are we getting wealthier? And this is a comparison South Africa to the rest of the world. And starting in 1994, that 100 line there, that solid line on top, that is the per capita income of the rest of the world. And the other line, the bottom line here, this is South Africa. And as you can clearly see over time, South Africa, relative to the rest of the world, has been getting poorer. We are getting poorer. Of course, we're better off than 10 years or whatever ago, but the rest of the world is much better off, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So even if you compare South Africa to Africa, we are still about 2.5 times as wealthy as the average sub-Saharan African, but even sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region in the world, is catching up with South Africa. We're still far ahead, but even them are catching up with us. Now here, look at this. This is absolutely a horrible graph. The same sort of thing. Now I looked at China in this instance. In 1994, the average Chinese was the average South African was more than 4 times as wealthy as the average Chinese. I know China had this amazing, miraculous economic growth the last couple of years, the last couple of decades, but why didn't we do the same? Why didn't we follow the same sort of policies and things? And today, our income in South Africa is roughly about half of that, the average Chinese. This is horrible. We could have been so much better off. Imagine if your income today was 5-6 times more than what it actually is. That's a comparison there. This is part of the reason for that. This is the moving average, the graph, by the way. The solid line is the average electricity generation internationally. And in 1994, 95 actually, South Africa generated more electricity than the average per capita electricity generation in the world. And today it's about less than 65% of that. So of course, if you don't have electricity, your economy cannot grow. This is a very important structural problem that we have in South Africa and why the economy is not growing. The single most important number, as far as I'm concerned, when you compare countries to one another, is life expectancy. Life expectancy correlates with everything that's good, with economic growth, with good health services, with good education, with everything, law and order, everything. Life expectancy is the most important number. This is our life expectancy. In 1994, South Africa's average life expectancy was about 95% of that of the world. And then we had a disastrous ANC Mbeki policy about AIDS. And the only good thing that I can think of that Zuma did was to turn that around. And we saw quite a substantial, significant increase in life expectancy. But even today, it's still well below to where we were in 1995. In fact, Average life expectancy in today in South Africa is lower than that of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, lower than that of sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and if you do these sort of things to your economy and you have such a negative impact on the economy at all sort of levels, then people don't trust you anymore. These are a set of numbers that I got from the World Bank, and this is what we think about corruption in South Africa, and it's no surprise to see it's come down, and we simply don't trust our government. We think we've got a corrupt government in South Africa. World Bank data. Do we think our government is effective and efficient? Do they do a proper job? And the answer is no. We think they're not very good. This is another perception index on that. Okay, do we have political stability and lack of violence and terrorism and all that? Initially in 1994 it was quite low, certainly not good. And then the first couple of years of full democracy in South Africa, things improved quite dramatically. And then the last 10 years or so, things deteriorated quite significantly, and especially what we saw last year in KZN and Gauteng and so on, that actually contributed to the decline in the specific index. This is something I'm very concerned about. I'm going to touch on this a little bit later. I'm worried that we're going to see more of the violence that we saw last year. And I'm going to give you reasons why I think so. Okay, I'm going to show you this specific graph a number of times this morning. The dotted line is estimates going forward. So the actual numbers are up to the dotted line. And this graph is the single most important graph. This one and the next one. So just keep an eye on this graph. I'm going to show it to you a couple of times. The red line is state spending as a percentage of GDP. Okay? The blue line is state revenue, mostly taxes, as a percentage of GDP. And there's an important other piece of information there. There's a gap between the two, how much they spend and how much they get in. That is referred to as the fiscal deficit, and that is how much money the state basically borrows every year. And as you can clearly see, they always spend more than what they get in. There was an exception in 2007, 2008, when that was Trevor Manuel. No, when was it Trevor Manuel? I think it was still Trevor Manuel. When initially reduced state spending, as you can see the red line, and that resulted in a fiscal surplus, and state debt levels were brought down quite dramatically. I'm going to show you now. But the important point I want to make here, if you look at that red line, you will see for the last couple of years, the Minister of Finance always tells us state spending will start coming down in 2 years' time. It will come down in 2 years' time. And next year it will be another 2 years before state spending comes down. We need to reduce state spending. If we go back 60 years, you will see state spending as a percentage of GDP doubled in South Africa. So the state is double the size it was in 1960s or 1961, for example, 63 in this instance. And of course, if the state spends more money, they need to get in money somewhere. And that's the blue line. But the amount of money that they're getting is falling behind the amount of money that they actually need. And the result of that is this one. And this is state debt as a percentage of GDP. Now, currently, our state debt as a percentage of GDP is roughly about 70% of GDP. In the case of the Japanese, it is close to about 300% of GDP, much, much higher than ours. The Americans, about 120%, and many European countries are well above 100% of GDP. But the big difference is, if we want to borrow money, 10-year money in South Africa, we have to pay 10% for that. If you want to lend money to the German government, as an example, you have to pay them before they take your money. That's the big difference. So it's not only the levels of debt that matter, but it's also the price that you pay for this debt. And people just don't trust South Africa, and therefore they demand very high returns if they do lend us money. While many people in the world are very, very happy to give money to the Japanese and the Germans and many other countries in the world. The similar interest rate for the Americans is currently 2%, so we pay 10%. And that's the big difference, is the cost of debt in South Africa is much higher than the rest of the world. All right, just a couple of economic data, a couple of economic numbers that I think are important. Inflation currently in South Africa hovering between 5 and 6% or so. I'm a little bit concerned about inflation. The Lesetja Kganyago, he wants to reduce the inflation targeted band. I was actually hoping for that to be announced in the budget. It was not announced, but I would like to see inflation or the inflation target band to be reduced. That it's currently 3 to 6%. Bring it down and eventually target a point target of the Lesetja Kganyago suggests 3%. I think it should be 2% or even lower. Inflation is a bad thing. It's a very, very bad thing. So inflation currently in South Africa, it's certainly not in the double figures, and it's not going to go there. But I also, because of that, I believe that the Reserve Bank will continue to increase interest rates. So expect another 325 bips for this year, or maybe 425 bips for this year. Currently, the repo at 4%, the repo can easily be at about 5% by the end of this year. Expect that, but don't be too concerned. It's probably not going to go up much higher than that going forward. It depends really on things like the oil price and inflation and stuff like that. The balance of payments, currently we have a nice surplus on the balance of payments, primarily because of the current account. What it means, we export much more than what we're getting in because of the commodity cycle currently. The Minister of Finance reckons that's going to go down to basically to 0 by the end of this year and dip into a negative next year and a year thereafter. I agree, roughly. And that basically means that if a surplus on our current account is likely to dip into a negative next year, and that is likely to put pressure on the exchange rate of the currency, depending what happened to the American interest rates environment. So I'm concerned about the currency, not now, but by the end of this year, kind of, and next year as well. I will go show you a little bit later something on the exchange rate of the currency. The rand, the state is a massive dis-saver. I always tell my students the following story. If you go and borrow money to build a new room for the new baby, that is fine. But if you go and borrow money to go to Mauritius to make the baby, that's not fine. So that's the difference between the two. And that's what we're doing in South Africa. We're borrowing a lot of money to pay on current expenditure. And I'm going to show you a graph on that. Unemployment levels very high. And this is, if I really need to, and I want to criticize the minister on one certain thing, and this is that he told us economic growth this year is going to be 2.1%. I think it's going to be a little bit lower, but it doesn't matter. It's going to be around about 2% or so. And next year is going to dip below 2%, and the year thereafter again below 2%. Even if our own Minister of Finance is not optimistic about economic growth, I mean, how can we be positive about the South African economy? So you must put measures in place to get this up to 4 and 5%, but they don't. And they won't, because of reasons that Mandy has mentioned, like, for example, nothing is going to happen until the end of this year, and then it's the election, and then nothing is going to happen until then either. And that's why we're stuck in this 2% growth trajectory in South Africa. And on the top of all of that, we've got electricity. We don't have electricity, and we can't grow faster than 2% because we don't have electricity. And Gwede Mantashe, he's just dragging his feet to allow us to generate electricity. There are many other issues on that as well, but that's not. Okay, this is just a current account that I just want to show you. So it's doing very well. That is part of the reason why the rand is relatively strong at the moment. This is the state's dis-saving, you know, this thing about going to Mauritius sort of stuff. So the state is a massive destroyer of capital in South Africa. So we save approximately 15% of GDP, and the state destroys 3 or 4% of that. So if you borrow money and you spend on current expenditure, then you destroy the existing savings. You have to take the existing savings in the economy and build factories and infrastructure and stuff like that. What we do, we use some of this money to pay grants and to pay salaries and things like that. At least there's an improvement now in the current, or at least in the coming financial year. This is unemployment levels in South Africa. Now, I mean, this is horrible. This is absolutely horrible. But the problem in South Africa is not unemployment. The problem is economic growth. The problem also is not poverty. The problem is economic growth. The problem is not inequality. The problem is economic growth. If you get the economy to grow, all these problems will be addressed. But the economy is not growing. It's stuck in a 2% growth trajectory. So unemployment, this is the narrow definition of unemployment. The broader definition of unemployment is closer to 50%, 47%. And if you just completed matric last year, chances are you're not going to have a job. The end of this year, chances are probably that you're going to be unemployed. And an unemployment rate will be roughly about 70% of people that just completed matric. Imagine that. And the best way to get a good job, by the way, the best way to get a good job is to get a job. You must get a job. That's the best way in getting into the labor market. Even if you're not paid anything, you have to get into the labor market one way or the other. The longer you're out of the labor market, the longer it's going to take you to get into the labor market. The more difficult it becomes. This is economic growth. Last year saw probably quite nice economic growth. The year before was 2020. That was a collapse. We all know that. And then there's something called so-called base reasons. Remember, economic growth is calculated from one period compared to the previous period. And because 2020 was such a horrible year, 2021 will look much better. So it's a base effect to that. And because 2021 is going to look much better, 2022 is going to look a little bit worse. But as you can clearly see, this is the minister's estimates, and you can see that economic growth is likely to slow down. And I agree more or less with those numbers. Okay, let me show you again this graph, the important one, state spending. We're going to start cutting back on state spending relative to the economy, but only in 2 years' time, really. In the meantime, taxes are under some pressure. But where's all this money coming from? And here it is. This is a composition of revenue in South Africa. This is who are doing all the paying in South Africa on taxes in South Africa. The most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance, 38%, is that of personal income taxes. Remember, this is the most important revenue source, nearly 40%. Most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance, personal income tax. The second most important income or revenue source to the Minister of Finance, 28% here at the bottom, is a value-added tax. The third one is that 17%, that's corporate income tax. And then a couple of other ones. Look at that other 6% over there. The 6% is the fuel levy. So the fuel levy is actually the fourth most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance. And a couple of other ones. Okay. You can see there's a minus 3% on top there. That's the South African Customs Union. We pay 44 billion rand over to the other members of the Customs Union in South Africa. The Customs Union are countries like Lesotho and Swaziland and Namibia and so on. They are part of the Customs Union, and we pay over 44 billion annually, or that's the budget of the Minister of Finance. I'm going to analyze this a little bit more. All right. So what happened to the Minister of Finance? He made some announcements on personal income taxes. So I adjust some of this announcements. There's something called fiscal drag, nothing to do with clothes. It's called fiscal drag. What happens if your income goes up, you fall into the next income tax bracket quite often. So the Minister of Finance, he adjusted that a little bit down, or adjusted the brackets up a little bit to fix the effect of inflation, to account for the effect of inflation. He told us he gave us back X billions of rands. He didn't give us back anything. All he did is simply just adjust it so we don't pay more. And the effect of that is about 4.5%, more or less in line with inflation. So there was no money given back. It's simply to bring us back to where we were a year before the effect of inflation pushed out into the higher income brackets. The fuel levy, there was no increase in the fuel levy, and that really came as a big surprise to me. It's the first time since 1991 that the fuel levy was not increased. If I was the Minister of Finance, I would have increased the fuel levy. All taxes are always bad, but there are some taxes that are worse than other taxes. So I would have increased the fuel levy by even a lot, even a rand or so, and rather reduce some of the other more damaging taxes in the economy, like personal income taxes, and more specifically, corporate income taxes, company taxes. I would have reduced that much more. Anyway, so the fuel levy not increased, and the road accident fund also not decreased. Keep in mind that the road accident fund, the actual loss on the road, or the actual deficit on the road accident fund at the moment is approximately 300 billion rand already. It's not accounted for in any debt of the state, by the way. So it's about 300 billion rand. So by not increasing the road accident fund, we're simply increasing that deficit. So it's in a way we're kind of borrowing from the future by not increasing the road accident fund at the moment. I think, by the way, we need to change the way that we manage. I think the road accident fund is a good idea, but we need to introduce a cap on how much you can claim from the road accident fund, because that has become a milk cow for so many lawyers in South Africa. But try to put a cap on the road accident fund and how much you can claim from that, and you will have an army of lawyers on your back, I'm sure. Corporate income tax. The announcement of the corporate income tax coming down to 27% is not new. This was announced about 2 years ago already. They're slowly implementing it. It will apparently be implemented next year. There are some technical adjustments here and there, but it's still far too high. Corporate income tax is 27% is just too high. The OECD average is 23%, and that's who we are trading with. So we need to reduce corporate income taxes even more in South Africa. Some other technical adjustments, you're not allowed to write off more than 80% of assessed loss, for example. Previously, you could write down 100% of that. Sin taxes were increased, and there's a new tax on vaping vapors out there, more or less in line with the inflation rate. I know we can debate whether it is a good thing or a bad thing. Just keep in mind that during the time in 2020 with the lockdown, and last year as well, by preventing people from zolling, buying cigarettes and alcohol and all that, you basically force people into the illegal cigarette and alcohol market, and that got a huge boost. I mean, I can remember when the lockdown was announced, the second lockdown, the first time we were caught off guard a little bit, but the second lockdown, when that was announced, the SMSs and the WhatsApps came in. You want Black Label, you want Jameson, you want this, and you could get anything. at the price, but you could get anything. The point is, the lockdown actually supported the underground economy on those sectors, and by increasing the prices of cigarettes or alcohol too much, now you're only doing a favor to that illegal economy anyway. So be careful with that. Carbon tax, the implementation of that has been postponed. I mentioned this, what's new here? Okay, so remember the commodity cycle doing very well. We're exporting like crazy, so the Minister of Finance is getting more taxes in than previously thought. Just remember, this is not a surplus. We still have a deficit, like I've showed you in that graph. The deficit is just a little bit smaller than previously thought. And the Minister of Finance says it's about 182 billion overrun on taxes. I think it's too conservative. It's going to be around about 200 billion in the current financial year. And of course, if this 200 billion, he spent more than 100 billion of that already on all various things, and I'll get to that just now. Interesting, it was not in the budget speech, but it was one of the interviews that the minister had. He said, we remember when we increased the taxes, personal income taxes, the marginal rate from 41 to 45%, and the minister then, who was it? I think it was the smiling suit. He said we're going to get in so much more money and so on. But was it the weekend special? No, I think it was a smiling suit. And he said we're going to get in so much more, and we did not get in that much more. The point I want to make is that if we want more money, we need more money in order to reduce the fiscal debt, the burden. But if we want to get more money, personal income taxes is just not it. Because we are squeezing the personal income taxpayer to such an extent now, if you increase personal income taxes, you actually collect in less. And that's what the Minister of Finance actually said as well. I agree with him. Here's something that we have to take note of this. Take note of this. If you have assets of 50 million or more, you have to declare that to SARS at market value. Let that sink in for a moment. The minister said to make sure that we're all compliant with taxes and all that. They always say that. But I've got a suspicion this could be the beginning of something really bad. This could just be the beginning of a wealth tax. So from now on, all you wealthy people, and there are plenty of you in this room, I'm sure you have to declare your assets if you're worth more than 50 million to SARS. Okay. I've made some calculations. I'm going to skip this on what you're actually saving annually. Now, look at this one. Sorry, this is the previous one. Remember, the most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance is personal income taxes. Personal income taxes contributes 38% of total taxes to the Minister of Finance. Now, this is a graph that we did yesterday. This is all the number of registered personal income taxpayers in South Africa. There are 15 million of them. 15 million people are personal income taxpayers. Half of that 15 million, it's about 8 million people, do not pay any personal income taxes whatsoever. Okay. The other half, they pay all the personal income taxes. But that's not all. 0.8%, 0.9%, that is 133,000 individuals in South Africa pay 29% of total personal income taxes. This is dramatically so-called progressive. So few people just pay just about all the taxes, personal income taxes in South Africa. But that's nothing. Look at this one. This is the third most important tax to the Minister of Finance. This is corporate income taxes. Corporate income taxes, there are, I don't know even how many companies there are in South Africa, registered companies in South Africa, but 0.09 companies in South Africa, that's 770 companies in South Africa pay 63% of all company taxes in South Africa. We can say we don't have company taxes in South Africa. And by the way, those are mostly big companies making a lot of money, but 770. Of that 770, I guess approximately 100 of them or so are listed on the JSE. So why are the other 600 not listed? So that's, I think, the responsibility of the JSE to get them to come and list. But nevertheless, 770 companies paying just about all the taxes, or well, 63% of taxes in South Africa. Let me just also make a comment about company taxes. Companies in South Africa or nowhere in the world actually do pay tax. Companies always shift their total tax burden down to individuals by way of an increase in the prices of their goods and services. In other words, they make things more expensive, or they pay their workers less, or they pay smaller dividends to their shareholders. And in the end, companies don't pay taxes. We can just as well get rid of company taxes and levy taxes somewhere else, on something else in the economy. In the end, you pay all taxes. Companies don't pay taxes. Okay, so let me go back to this normal graph. In 2 years' time, we will start spending less. But what are we spending money on? This is what we're spending money on. The most important spending item for the Minister of Finance is that blue one over there, education. And education is approximately 23% of total state spending. That's where your money goes to. The second most important one is this one on the right, 17%, that orange one. That's social protection, and that is mostly the various grants. Okay, and then there's another one, this gray one at the bottom here, that's interest and state debt. We have to keep an eye on that one because that one is all the big expense items of the Minister of Finance, interest and state debt is the one going up fastest. Okay, and that's where a lot of spending actually goes to. Now look at this graph. Now this is something I've calculated yesterday quickly. So remember now, we have 19 million people receiving the normal grants in South Africa, 19 million. We've got more than 10.5 million people receiving the special COVID grant, which has been extended for another year. And we have 2 million civil servants getting an income from the state. So we have 32 million people getting an income from the state every month. We have, and I'm going to show you now, we've got 12 million people working in the private sector, by the way, in a productive sector. So the Minister of Finance told us that this special grant, the President told us, the special COVID grant will be extended for another year, which is more than 10 million people, and then it will come to an end. That's what he told us. If that happens, then the spending on the social expenditure will come down next year, and then by next year, in 2 years' time, interest and state debt will actually be more than spending on social grant. And then it becomes the second most important expense item for the Minister of Finance, and it's only education which will be bigger now. But I don't think this is how things are going to work out. I'm going to share it just now. So, just another comment I want to make before I come back to that one. The President also announced the appointment of a special red tape SAR in the presidency. That's an example of double expenditure, because the job of the Minister of Small Business Development, for example, her job should be to get rid of red tape. Isn't it the job of the Minister of Energy Affairs and Mining and Energy to get red tape in mining? And the reason why the President announced and introduced this position, or appointed somebody to look after red tape and try to get rid of red tape, is because those ministers are not doing their jobs. That's their job to do these sort of things. Now that's an example of a cabinet that's all over the place and not working together. I mentioned the 12-month special relief grant, or the so-called COVID grant, will be the increase in the various the grants were more or less in line with inflation. The minister expects the civil servant wages to go up by 1.8% over the next 3 years. I am not so sure he will be able to do that. Kusato is not going to like that. Remember, the civil servants have been getting huge wage increases for the past 10 years. That's part of the reason why we are in trouble. Although the minister did say there's a 20 billion rand sort of a sweetener, so if we can pull them over the line to accept a relatively below inflation increase in the salaries of the civil servants, and he increased the youth wage support to 50%, to a maximum of 1,500 rand, and then there's a special contingency reserve of about 10 billion rand. The reason why I mentioned this, except for Kusato, there were no announcements on the support of the state-owned enterprises, and I think that's where it's going to come from, on this contingency reserve. I know the Land Bank has defaulted on its debt, for example. I know that, we all know, Denel is very deep in trouble. We know the ANCBC is very deep in trouble, the whole bunch of them. And I think that, and we know that South African Airways is going to get another 3.5 billion rand. Do you know that? So, and I think that some of the money is going to come out of this 10 billion rand. But coming back to this, all right, I did mention about all these people that are receiving the various grants in South Africa, and that's that red line. That is how many people are receiving grants in South Africa. And we saw this huge spike in the number of people receiving grants. 10 million people added to grant recipients, which is supposed to be temporary. And from next year, it's supposed to go back to its previous line of only 20 million people or so. So you see that massive increase in the people that are dependent on the state. Remember, you have to add another 2 million to that, because those are the number of civil servants, bringing it up to 32 million. The blue line is the people in jobs in South Africa. But last year and the year before, we lost about 2 million people officially working in South Africa. Huge increase in unemployment because of the lockdown and all that. And today, if you look at the green line, there is, for every one person that's got a job in South Africa, including the civil servants, for every one person with a job, there are 2 people receiving a grant. It's just not sustainable. I mean, you have to get this economy to grow because we cannot afford this. We're going to get into very deep trouble. We're there already. Okay, back to the normal graph. In 2 years' time, we will start spending less. In the meantime, we spend more than we get in, so we borrow a lot of money. And this is the fiscal deficit, hugely improved from last year. We're still running a fiscal deficit, and the minister penciled in the fiscal deficit of 6% of GDP in an environment where the economy is growing at 2%. So if the economy is growing at 2% and the deficit is 6% of GDP, roughly speaking, we add another 4% to debt every year. So we need to bring that down much, much more to at most 2% of GDP, the fiscal deficit, because that's more or less in line with economic growth. The result, of course, is this huge increase in state debt levels. You can see where it really happened. It happened on this last end year. From actually, Pravin Gordhan, he was the Minister of Finance during the time of this huge increase in state. Of course, he was the beginning of that period, and he was there as well. I just don't understand why people think he walks on water. He was the Minister of Finance that when the state-owned enterprises were run into the ground, he was the Minister of Finance when the wheels came off on the finances of the fiscal accounts. So why is that everybody says he's some sort of saint? I can't believe that. The Minister of Finance, this is some good news. Initially, he said that in the year 24-25, the debt level of the state debt as a percentage of GDP will level off and start coming down. Now, because of this extra revenue now, he says state debt as a percentage of GDP will stop increasing a year earlier now, 23-24. Well, we'll have to wait and see on that. Did you know that each one of you own approximately 70,000 rand more than what you think you own? That is a per capita state debt in South Africa, which means that you pay every year about 4,300 rand extra on the debt that you own or that the Minister of Finance incurred on your behalf. Debt is then to stabilize at about 75% of GDP in the year 24-25. It's possible, but the ministers with a number of assumptions. If any one of those assumptions do not work out, if the oil price stays at $100, for example, if the gold price comes down a little bit, the platinum price comes down, or Eskom falls over again, that sort of stuff, then it's going to be, then we're going to have to move that year out another year or so. This is how he's going to borrow, how he's going to fund the fiscal deficit, about 245 billion on normal capital market instrument. That's normal state debt instruments, long-term instruments, mostly from pension funds and insurers and banks and so on. By the way, banks are lending more and more money to the state. And the IMF indicated that they're getting very uncomfortable with that. They think that the banks are too exposed to the state. So they're getting worried about that. I don't think it's something to be too concerned yet, but we're moving in the wrong direction. Banks are lending too much money to the state, and when long-term interest rates suddenly go up, for example, then the banks may get into trouble, and of course then the Reserve Bank will have to bail them out, and it means you will have to bail them out. The Minister of Finance is going to make use of the existing about 100 billion rand of existing cash balances to fund these fiscal deficits, a bit of a technical thing, and a fiscal deficit to 6% of GDP. A couple of other things, and we want to get to some questions as well. What happened to zero-based budgeting? Nothing. We need to start with zero-based budgeting because there's a lot of state spending that's simply a waste of money. We haven't heard anything about that. Nothing much on the state-owned enterprises except for Eskom and except for that 10 billion contingency reserve, which I think will be used for the state-owned enterprises. But the state-owned enterprises are still there. The land bank is still bankrupt. The same goes for many of the other state-owned enterprises. So what now? We can't get a proper plan, a solution to the state-owned enterprises. There will be new legislation introduced to allow individuals to access their pension funds. But remember, you may be allowed to access your pension fund before you don't have to resign, for example. So you may be able to access your pension fund to pay off a house or some sort of medical emergency or something like that. But but you will probably be limited if you resign on how much of that you can withdraw. You will probably be limited and not be allowed to withdraw your own whole pension fund if you resign, like currently is the case. The customs union in South Africa, like I've mentioned, we pay 44 billion to the other countries around us in the customs union. I've calculated that it should be more in line about 22 billion, so we completely overpay for that. South Africa is one of the biggest, relative to GDP, one of the biggest donors in the world. So why don't we call it what it is? And it is a donation to the countries around us, because that is exactly what it is. Something that you will not hear from any other economist except for Professor Rousseau, perhaps, and that is that, remember, there are many countries part of the South African monetary area, countries like Namibia and Swaziland and Eswatini, they basically use the South African currency. If somebody uses your money, then they basically pay a tax to you. If you use the US dollar, for example, we basically pay a tax to the Americans. And pretty much the same with the countries in this monetary area, and they pay, and we refund them for the fact that they're using our currency and basically paying a tax to us, and we refund them to the tune of about 1.8 billion rand annually. The point I want to make here is that I don't think the Minister of Finance should have this on his own income statement, basically. It should not be part of the fiscal accounts. It's actually the Reserve Bank's responsibility. Because the Reserve Bank is the monetary authority in South Africa, and it should actually, the Reserve Bank should actually be paying this and not the taxpayer, which in the end doesn't matter, but just to keep the books clean, I would rather move this to the Reserve Bank. The wage bill is a major issue in South Africa still. The wage bill has been going up dramatically, and I really wonder whether the Minister of Finance will be able to cut back on that. And then I did mention that the IMF is concerned about some of the numbers in South Africa. Now, let me tell you why I'm very concerned about what we saw last year. We have, like I've said, 32 million people depending on the state for an income. They say 10 million of them will lose the special COVID grant next year. The Minister of Finance also says that 2 million civil servants will get an increase in salaries well below the inflation rate, basically telling us that 12 million people's income at least, or maybe the other 20 million as well, but at least 20 million or 12 million people's income will fall over the next, or maybe disappear over the next 2 or 3 years or whatever. Now, if you really want to make people angry, take their money away. And that's why I'm concerned about social tension and political tension building up in South Africa again. Watch out for this. I'm very worried. We can't afford it to keep on paying all of this, and we can't afford stop paying it as well. So we on the back of a tiger. I don't know if people realize, but we have been going through a massive privatization drive in South Africa the last couple of years, 1 or 2 decades. People don't realize that. And Kusatu doesn't realize this. Let me give you some numbers. In the 1980s, South African Airways covered probably just about 100% of all the local domestic flights. Today, it is 0. Domestic flights and airlines basically in South Africa, they have all been privatized. Of course, through the back door, and the only difference is the state didn't get 1 cent for that. It has been privatized, but the state didn't get anything for that. Broadcasting, the same, although there were some licenses paid, so the state did get a bit of an income for that. Telecom, pretty much the same, or telecommunications, pretty much the same, although there was actually a bit of a privatization and an income from the state. The post office, a very good example. In the 1980s and 1990s, the post office was the sole post office that delivered letters and parcels in South Africa. Today, they do just about nothing of that because you can't trust them anymore. So the post office has been privatized. The post office still has a monopoly on letters, although they simply cannot deliver letters, so we illegally make use of Dawnwing to deliver letters. We're not allowed to do that. It's illegal to do that. The post office has been privatized. The only difference is the state didn't get any money for that. So why didn't we privatize it and at least get some money for that? The railroads has been privatized because we can't reuse the railroads anymore. Everything has been moved on trucks, on the roads. And that's why the roads look what they look like. So it has been privatized to a large extent, and the state did not get 1 cent for that. We even went as far as privatizing the police in South Africa. There are 3.5 times as many private sector security people in South Africa than policemen. We've privatized the police. Can you believe that? The same goes for health services, for education and things like that. And we have a government saying they don't want to privatize anything. They've privatized everything in South Africa because of their incompetence and their corruption. And this is coming back to you, Mandy. I'm very optimistic about South Africa. One reason is because we have a government collapsing all over the place. So if you want to do business in South Africa, all you have to do is just go and do what the state is supposed to be doing, and you will have a roaring business in South Africa. And that's what people are doing. That's one way of doing it. And of course, there are some technological adjustments and things happening. And all you need to do to be part of this wonderful new world of technological advancements is that you have to be physically safe in South Africa. You have to have the skills. You have to have the hardware. And you have to have proper broadband, and you can participate in the modern economy, doesn't matter where you are. And of course, we have got nice brandy and steaks in South Africa. So don't tell the kids necessarily to immigrate. There are really opportunities. It doesn't matter where you are nowadays because of technological changes. The fiscal accounts, the minister, generally speaking, the Minister of Finance, I think I agree with him more or less. I don't have much disagreement with him, but we're sailing very close to the wind. And if there's some sort of hiccup along the way, then the fiscal accounts can deteriorate very, very quickly, very sharply, and we're going to get into big trouble. There isn't really much space for movement. But in order to keep this around and turn this around, we need very, very strong political leadership, something that we simply do not have. We don't have that because of the personality of our dear president. We don't have it because of the elections at the end of the year. We won't have it because there's another of the leadership elections. There's a proper election in 2 years' time. So we will never get to the point where we actually take a stance and fix these sort of things because there's always something happening. This is a technical thing on how I think you should construct your portfolio. This is my job. I tell people how to construct your portfolio and so on. Unless there are questions, I'm happy to answer this. And then let me come back to this one that I mentioned earlier, that if you're 50 million rand plus, you have to tell SARS about that. And I'm very concerned about this, in that is that this is the beginning of a wealth tax, people. Watch out for this. Make sure your assets are structured, and make sure a proper, a big chunk of your assets are invested abroad, and do it in such a manner that you are in control of your assets, but you do not own your assets. Think about that a moment. You do not want to own your assets, but you want to be in control of your assets. Because you don't want to tell SARS, I've got 100 million rand. Okay, it's completely and totally legal. Get a good financial advisor to do that. Okay, and then on the currency, we do some calculations on the currency. The currency currently at about 15 to the US dollar. This is our calculation. We call it the barometer. The rand at 15 to the US dollar is more or less where it's supposed to be. If the rand is going to 17 or 18 to the US dollar, I will advise people not to move money. If the rand goes to 13 or 12 to the US dollar, I would advise people to take a lot of money out. So the rand is where it is at about 15, more or less in the middle of where it's supposed to be. So now is as good a time as any if you want to take money out of the country. And then the last one, take your phone and take a picture of this. And if you want this presentation, I'll send it to you. Just take a picture. Everything will happen thereafter. It will happen automatically. Take a picture of this. I'll send you. If there are any economic questions or anything like that, I will be very happy to try to answer that. Just take this and I'll send the presentation to you if you want to have a look at it again and be bored again. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dawie. I think that was insightful and fascinating. I personally can't wait to tell SARS that I have 100 million rand, because that's just never going to happen in reality. I don't know about the rest of you in this room. So I have a couple of questions for you, and then I would like to open it to the floor. So think about that. So one of the reasons that this has been a so-called good news budget is because of the commodity boom. So we have this tax windfall, and Enoch Godongwana has been saying that he doesn't know how long this commodity boom is going to continue for. What is your view on that? How long do you think we can count on that forward, and what's the impact going to be?
Yes, the commodity boom, how long is that going to go up on? I did mention there's this wave of additional demand happening globally, but you have to make a distinction between a demand for goods and a demand for services. Now, let me give you a practical example. If you lock me up for a year in my house, then I'm not allowed to buy a computer, I'm not allowed to buy a TV or to buy new clothes and this and that and so on. And I'm also not allowed to go out to have lunch when I have my hair cut. And if you suddenly let me out now, I'm going to run, have my hair cut and have lunch or whatever, but I'm not going to have 2 haircuts. I'm not going to have 2 lunches. But I am going to buy a TV and a flat screen and a computer and a new denim and all that. The point I want to make, if you lock down economies and you open them up again, there's this surge in extra demand, but the extra demand is mostly directed to goods and less to services. And that's what we're currently seeing. And that's the reason for the increase in the commodity prices. So the moment that slows down, the moment this wave of demand works its way through the economy, we're going to see commodity prices coming down, and we're already seeing that. So I think depending on economic growth, commodity prices is likely to remain elevated to an extent for the next year or so, and thereafter start coming down a little bit more to more realistic levels. So I think there's a window of about a year or so.
And then you speak there about having a haircut. So what do you think about the kasi economy in South Africa, the informal sector? Okay. So G.G. Alcock puts the food economy of the informal sector at something like 90 billion rand. There's been a massive growth in the kasi economy, which doesn't go into our account and into the fiscus. So what do you think about that?
By the way, the informal economy, they do pay taxes. They pay taxes like, for example, indirect taxes, like the fuel levy, like the value-added tax and things like that. So they pay many of these, not all of the taxes. They don't necessarily pay income taxes and so on. The informal economy in South Africa, economists agree it's roughly about 10% or so of the economy, but I disagree with that. I think it's significantly bigger than that, much, much bigger. But not only the informal economy, also the so-called gig economy, which are not properly captured in economic data. So I think there's much more economic activities going on than what the actual data actually tells us. And that's another reason to be positive about South Africa.
My last question before I open to the floor, basic income grant. We've heard a lot of talk about that. You've shown us how much money the state is already spending, 46% on social grants as things are because of the extension of the 350 rand grant. Is it feasible, a basic income grant?
Basic income grant, we just cannot afford it. That's the number simply. I showed you the numbers. We simply cannot afford it. But I do think a basic income grant will become a reality in South Africa. You can't give people money and take it back again. So it will be 2 years now for the COVID grant. I think there will be not necessarily a basic income grant, but there will be some sort of change to the social security system to incorporate the unemployed adults in South Africa as well. So I think, yes, a basic income grant or a watered-down version is a reality in South Africa. It is a political reality.
Okay, questions? Anybody? You can stick your hands up if you like, either for Dawie or if you have some political questions, I can maybe answer. I'm going to run around a little bit over here to the back.
Thank you, Dawie, for that concise presentation and unpacking the budget speech. A number of us here are in property, and we use leverage or gearing. Now we can see that interest rates have started ticking, and it looks like the next every quarter that the MPC has a meeting, we're going to see an increase in interest rates, which has got significant bearing of the property industry. At what point are we going to see this interest rate coming down? Because if you look at where the interest rates were, they were the lowest ever in the last 40 years. And we were all doing very well, but now the pendulum is changing. What's going to be happening with this industry?
Yes. So the question basically is about what's going to happen, the trajectory of interest rates in South Africa, well, globally. But globally, what's going to happen to interest rates, this is what I see at the moment. Things can always change. If there's a war in Europe and there's a war in Taiwan and the world collapses and all of that, the interest rates may actually come down. So that's even possible. But what we see at the moment is the following. We're probably going to see interest rates going up in South Africa. Globally, it's probably going to go up a little bit longer until middle of next year or so. But it's not only interest rates. Quantitative easing or quantitative tightening will be introduced in the United States. Basically comes down to the same thing, more or less. So I see for the next year or maybe year and a half an increase in interest rates, not to astronomically high levels like what we saw in the early 90s in South Africa. Thereafter, it's probably going to be a little bit flat, and then interest rates will start coming down or be maintained. The natural level for interest rates in the US, for example, should be about 3% or so. Currently, depending on which one you look at, currently interest rates in the US is roughly about just below 2% or so. So there's 100 basis points in the US, and then it's at its natural level, more or less, which means that we're probably going to do about another 100 bips or so, maybe 150 bips, and then it's there. But having said that, it is, like I've said, quite possible that some sort of crisis can lead to interest rates actually coming down. And what I'm particularly concerned about in South Africa is if the state debt levels keep on going up like this, remember there's a couple of ways of repaying your debt. You can actually repay your debt, that's one way of doing that, or you can simply refuse to repay your debt. And a very popular thing that politicians use to repay their debt is to allow for inflation to go up. Inflation erodes the value of money, but inflation also erodes the value of debt. And that's one of my big concerns. If we cannot keep a lid on debt going up in South Africa, then high inflation in South Africa is a very good possibility for South Africa going forward. And when the Lesetja Kanyagu is in charge of the Reserve Bank, he's really going to nail us on interest rates in order to keep inflation down. So that is a serious threat, but we're not there yet. And that's why it's so important for the Minister of Finance to keep a lot on state spending. So there's the answer, more or less. I think higher interest rates for the next year or year and a half, and thereafter interest rates probably be flat. There's always a question, should I fix my interest rates in South Africa? And the answer usually is no. Do not fix your interest rate. Because if you fix it, you're going to fix it higher than what you can get currently, firstly. And secondly, the banks will not allow you to fix it for longer than a year or two anyway. And then interest rates may be coming down. So don't fix it unless your cash flow is very tight. But don't fix, that's a general rule.
Okay, here we go.
You said you're in favor of narrowing the inflation band down to a fixed point. Why that not let it fluctuate between the bands?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. I love this. The question is, why am I in favor of lower inflation? First of all, let's just understand why inflation is bad. Now, you all understand why inflation is bad, because it's bad for poor people and it erodes your savings and all that sort of stuff. But there's something that makes inflation even worse than the things that we normally are aware of, the negative things about inflation. And there's this thing, and it is about prices. Now, I can talk, and I've studied communism. I love communism. Well, I love to hate communism. And prices were all fixed in the Soviet Union. And you were not allowed to change prices. And the result of that, the consequence of that, was that they had deficits most of the time, but sometimes they had surpluses. And you couldn't work away surpluses of deficits because prices were fixed. So prices are extremely important, and prices must go up and down. Because prices going up and down are signals to the economy: make more, make less, consume more, consume less. And you look at prices, and that's the wonder about money. It gives us this gauge, this ruler to measure things against one another, and prices tells us that. The problem with inflation is that all prices keep on going up. And if all prices keep on going up, we can't see the signals, and we cannot allocate resources in the economy optimally, and that leads to suboptimal economic activity. And that's why we need inflation low. The Reserve Bank's job must always be to get inflation low. Remember, the increase in the petrol price is not inflation. The increase in any price is not inflation. Inflation, and the definition of inflation, is when all things are becoming more expensive. That's one definition. Another definition is when the rand loses its value. And I prefer that definition. To rather look at inflation not as an increase in the price of petrol. It must be a sustained increase in the price of petrol. And the fuel of keeping inflation going is money. And it's impossible to have inflation without money. It's impossible to have inflation in a barter economy, as an example. So here are some reasons. Inflation must be low. It must be as low as possible, preferably at zero. So when we see increases in prices, we can know that there's an increase in price because there's an increase in demand or a slowdown in supply, or whatever the case might be, giving us the right signals so we can allocate the scarce money more optimally and get better economic growth. That's the reason.
Thanks, Dawie. If you can raise your hands if there are any more questions. In the meantime, perhaps a question that is apt for this room. Dawie, is property still a good investment?
Oh, I was worried about that one. Okay.
Count on me to ask the good questions.
Okay, let me give you the pluses and the minuses on property. The negatives on property is that property is illiquid. It's difficult to buy and sell property. You have to look after the ceiling, the geyser, and things. So you have to sort of maintain property. That's the negative. And the transaction cost of property is very, very high. It's expensive to buy and sell property. The good thing about property, it keeps track with inflation, more or less. And a very important positive about property is that you can gear property. You can borrow against property. So if you don't do that, then you're not making use of the benefits of property. So there are the pluses and the minuses. We are going through some major changes that will affect property, like on retail, like I've mentioned, for example. Work from home is another very good example on property. But people always will need property one way or the other. But there are huge changes taking place. For example, I think these huge shopping centers that we see, the character of shopping centers are changing. You will go to a shopping center now, not necessarily to buy, you should get a new denim, but buy a new denim. But you will go to and have a look at these denims and rather buy it and take a lot. So the shopping centers will probably change in character and become more place of relaxation. And we go for lunch or whatever. I think that's lifestyle kind of thing. Yes, I think so. I think.
Dawie, they spoke about when our ratings went down, they spoke about the benefit that South African debt was rand-based. Is that still the case, or are we starting to see more dollar-based debt in South Africa?
Oh, yes. Oh, I see your question is. Yes. One good thing about the ANC government, and they did that for the wrong reason, is that they mistrust the IMF and the World Bank and so on, and they didn't borrow too much money from those institutions. And of that debt that I showed you, 70% of GDP, only about 10% of that is denominated in non-rands, in dollars or in euros or whatever the case may be, which is relatively low. And the reserves at the South African Reserve Bank, currently standing at about $60 billion, is more than enough to pay that off. So that is one good thing, that one big potential problem that we do not have. Many other countries like Zambia just defaulted, for example. It's because of the huge foreign denominated debt, and we don't have that in South Africa, fortunately for us.
Any more questions? Any hands? Anyone? One last question. I'm surprised it hasn't been asked. It's something that I don't personally agree with, but what do you think of the possibility of a tax revolt gaining momentum in the country?
We have a tax revolt already in South Africa. Look at the tolls. There's nothing but a tax revolt. People come to me and they walk into my office and they tell me two things. I don't want to pay tax and I want to take my money out of the country. That's the two things. I'm not in favor of a tax revolt. It's a really, really bad idea. If we are successful with a tax revolt, and there are so many people calling me and asking me, shouldn't we start a tax revolt? But if we're successful in that, it's going to lead to the end of South Africa as a political entity. It could lead to South Africa falling apart politically. The best approach is to fix the problem, and the problem is politics. Get rid of this ANC government, because that's the problem. But the tax revolt is not. Pay as little tax as legal, but don't overdo that.
And politically, Dawie, I must say that what we saw in the local government elections with the decline of the ANC in major metropolitan areas is a good indication of what's going to happen in 2024. I think the ANC got a big fright.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that, but I think that we're on the brink of real change potentially in the country.
Without a doubt. You know,
if people go out and vote, because the turnout was so low.
And Mbeki said, if the ANC is voted out, it's going to lead to chaos. It may lead to chaos because of all these people, that's ANC patronage, people actually living off the state. So they may cause the ANC may cause the chaos, actually. So he's perhaps right. But I'm not scared of democracy anymore. So let's use democracy and get rid of this inferior parasitic government.
Okay, on that note, just checking there are no more questions before we close off. Okay, Dawie, we'll stick around for a little bit, I'm sure, if anybody does have any questions. But Dawie, thank you. I thought that was seriously insightful. It was a real breakdown of where we are in the country and what lies ahead. And for all of you that have more than 50 million rand in assets, don't forget to declare them, because I'm certainly not going to be doing that. But I'm sure all of you are and that you've enjoyed the breakfast as well. But thank you, Dawie. Thank you for all of you for coming out today. And thank you to Aucor Property as well for the breakfast and for this opportunity. Have a lovely day, everyone.